If you're a graphic or web designer, you've probably heard about grids. In this video, I'll walk you through what are grids, learn some common grid related terms, look at why we should be using grids, and then also talk about a common grid system widely used in the industry. So firstly, let's get started with thinking about what are grids. Grids basically divide any two-dimensional plane into smaller spaces, technically known as fields. But grids don't always have to be in 2D spaces. It could also be in 3D spaces where we have 3 dimensions and you're basically dividing that 3D space into different rectangular spaces. There, the technical term is compartments. But basically, as designers, we really need to care mostly about 2D planes when we're thinking about different layouts on posters as well as websites and applications and things like that. So now let's jump onto Figma and learn about some common grid terms and how to create and set up responsive grids. The first thing I'll do here is I'll go in here in Figma and I'll create a desktop board here. And what I'll do here, I'll show you how to sort of set up grids. Now, before we look into grids, there's one thing that's very interesting, which is a similar concept which is called guides. And what that work technically is basically it comes from ruler guides. So if you see on your Figma sort of layout, you have these rulers on the left side and on the top. And what you can basically do is just hover over them and basically drag out something called like a guide, right? And when you sort of bring it throughout your canvas here, you can see it's giving you this scale. And as soon as you drag it over a specific artboard, what you see is basically that it's giving you how much sort of the dimension is from sort of the edge of the artboard, right? So this is a guide, and what this basically helps us is basically helps us align different things. So if you have different content, including text, if you have photos, images, if you have different content on this canvas here, on this artboard, you can basically use this sort of guide here to align different things. But that's basically the limit of a guide, which is basically alignment. It doesn't help you in organizing anything more, but it's just a sort of guide for you to align different things. And you can bring a different guide from the top as well, and you can align it anywhere that you want, right? So that's just a basic concept, just a new quick thing that you should know about what you can do with guides. Now let's sort of think about what are grids, right? So the way to set up grids is basically you select this artboard like I have done right now. And what you can do is on the right side panel, you can go to this section called layout grids and you click on it. And what you see by default, what this creates for you is basically what is called a pixel grid. So for each pixel, you see that there is a specific grid. And if you open up this sort of section here by clicking this icon, you see that the size is 10. What this 10 denotes is it's a 10-point grid. What that means, if you really zoom into this, what you'll see is within each pixel, there are 10 points. That's how sort of Figma is calculating each pixel here, right? You can definitely change the size of points here. Like you can change to like an 8-point grid, and it does create that for you, right? And so within each pixel, now you have sort of 8 different points. Now, if you are interested in learning more about points and pixels and how different resolutions work, you can, check out my other videos on the channel. I have a dedicated video for that. But for now, you should just know that by default, Figma will create a pixel grid for you. Now, we generally will look at pixel grids later on, but first of all, let's talk about the most commonly used other grids, which is columns and rows. So basically, if you go here and click on column, what it will do by basic is like it will create this column grid where you can see different columns, right? And this sort of red sort of shapes that you're seeing is not really shapes, just a sort of layover on your artboard so that you know where you are sort of organizing different things. Now, some of the common terms that are used within the grids systems is basically what you see on this panel here. The first one is basically the width. So you can basically set the width of each of these columns, but generally that's not a very good idea because a better idea is to think about these things in terms of spacing between elements. So if you're thinking about spacing, you're not really thinking about the width here, but rather you're thinking about what we have here is margin and cutter. What does margin mean? Margin basically means the distance from the edge of the artboard to a specific column here. So we're gonna click on that and we're gonna set up a margin of 40 points. And what you see that it has set up 40 points on each side. but it doesn't really affect anywhere anything in the middle. Like it doesn't affect um, what are the sizes of each of these sort of gutters and things like that, what are the sizes of these columns, but it makes sure that there are definitely 40 points on each side as of the margin. The gutter is basically what you have between any two columns here, right? So these four items that you see here, these are the gutters, and you can definitely change the size, which is like if I say 40 points, it changes, right? And accordingly the content area, which is basically these columns, changes with these margins and gutters. And that's basically a good principle to use when you're thinking about spacing between different elements, right? So that's columns. Similarly, you have rows. You can just make it a row grid, and you can change the count. If you want, let's say 12 rows here, you can have 12. You can change the margin to 20 points, and you can have the gutter to, let's say, even less, let's say 10, right? And you have this amazing little gutter, right? And so this is what setting up grids looks like on Figma. Now you can definitely set up grids in different ways, and if you are interested to learn about different types of grids, feel free to tell me in the comments below, and I'll make a video about different types of grids and setting up different types of grids as well. But this is the basics of how you sort of set up different grids. And of course, once you have these grids set up, you can actually bring in different guides and things like that, sort of just to make sure that you're aligning different things. Another thing is, like, you don't always have to stay with one grid. You can definitely lay out multiple grids at the same time, right? So let's say I also want a column grid on top of this sort of row grid. So what I'll do is I'll create another grid by just hitting the plus button here. And what I have is another pixel grid by default. I'm going to change the pixel grid into a column grid. And I'll say that I need a margin of 40, and I'll keep the gutter to 20. And now what I have here is sort of a column grid as well as sort of a row grid in this one artboard. And I have a good sort of space here. So think about how to organize different things. So it's much better for you to think about how to organize things on this sort of layout rather than having just a blank canvas, right? So that's all about setting up different grids in Figma. Now, if you want to think about responsiveness, if you just select this artboard and if you sort of resize it, you'll see that it is by default responsive already, right? So you don't really have to do a lot of things to make it responsive. But think about different screens. For instance, let's say I want to go into like a tablet mode, and let's say I have a Surface tablet. Okay, maybe let's choose a different tablet with a different size here. Let's say I choose iPad Pro 11-inch. Let's say I'm looking at it in this version. So how do I bring this sort of grid that I already set up for my desktop version into this iPad? And so what I can do is I can go to this first artboard, and I can literally select the grids here. So I can select and just select this grid here, the column grid, and I'll hold shift and I'll select the row grid, and what I'll do is Control C or Command C to copy these grids. I'll go to this new artboard and I'll simply do Control V to paste it, and you'll see that I have set up the same grids right up here, right? Now, based on your needs, you can definitely change the grids here on your iPad or any other sort of different screen size. Maybe let's try with a phone layout. So if I go to phone, I can choose this phone layout. And what I'll do with the phone layout is I'll just do the same thing. I'll do a Control V to paste the same layout here. Now what you're seeing is, like, I probably don't need this much of a margin on the phone. I probably don't need these many columns. So what I can do is I can just go to columns. I'll just say I need maybe 2 columns, and I don't need this much margin. I just need 20 points of margin. So now I have the grid set up, and this is also responsive. So this is how you set up responsive grids in Figma. Now let's talk about why we should be using grids, right? We have all of these grids, and a lot of people think that these concepts are really sort of traditional, and these have come from the generations where we only had graphic designers use grids. And kind of part of that is definitely true, but there's definitely more to sort of why we should be using grids. So one of the first reasons why we should be using grids is for better organization. It gives you so much more control over all the content you have. Think about it. You have different text, you have different paragraphs, you have different headings, you have even different kinds of content, like you have different images, you have different videos probably on your websites, right? But once you have these grids set up, it really helps you organize different things. If you have, let's say, 5 different headings, if you have 10 different paragraphs, if you have 10 different images, if you have 2 different videos, and you have a blank canvas, it can be very overwhelming for you to think about, where do I put these different things? How do I organize these different things? But once you have a grid, you have a structure to think about as to, okay, these are the different boxes that I can put different things into. And now you have that basic underlying structure on top of which you can start being more creative, right? So it gives you that better organization and better control. Think about newspapers, right? Newspapers have been here forever. And if you think about newspapers, there is so much content there. It's so text heavy. There is so many ads going on. But if you really think about it, if you really looked at it, newspapers utilize grids all the time. And that's such a benefit of it. Like, if you read a newspaper, you really know very clearly what the different sections are, what particular news you're reading. It's just because of these different grids. And that's the first point about why we should use grids. The second thing here is that clear and impactful hierarchy, right? So once you have grids, you have different spaces and fields. Now you have a clear understanding of, like, how do I think about hierarchy? If I have a grid set up, I know that the top 2 columns, or like the top 2 rows, or the left 2 columns, maybe I'll keep it for something bigger, something more impactful, like a title or a heading section. And the lower right side could be something that is much less important, that doesn't need to be highlighted, right? So it gives you that hierarchy set up within these grids. The third thing is creating a balance between content and white space. Just like I showed you, grids helps you think about both in terms of content as well as thinking about the space around that content, creating that white space, right? Which comes to my second point. It helps you create layouts which have very readable type. Type and layouts and type and grids often go hand in hand, and I have other videos about type on my channel if you want to check them out. But if you have grids, you can really think about how to create better layouts where type is very easily readable. You can look up something called the baseline grids, and these baseline grids are created basically for having grids for text, and it helps you give a really good structure of, like, making these grids where you have text that is very easily readable. The next one is improved collaboration. Of course, like, if you have a grid and if you have, let's say, 10 designers on your team, if you don't have a grid, it's very hard to communicate as to, like, what kind of structure you're following. But if you have a grid structure that is the basic layout of your websites or applications, then it's very easy to sort of share that layout with everyone, share that grid format. And what your designers could do on your team is, like, they'll still sort of stick to that structure. So it helps improve collaboration, it helps bring consistency and cohesiveness, right? So if you are a specific brand, if you have a brand identity, if you want to stay with that similar style, you want to make sure you have a grid system in place, which will help make sure that your whole team is working on top of the same basic layer. And finally, the ability to create contrast. And this is one of those important points, is like, grids is not an old concept. It is in fact an old concept, but it's not a very traditional concept that you should not think about. It doesn't really limit you. It helps you be more organized. And if you want, you can always break the grids, right? If you want to create contrast, you can just break the grid at a certain point, and it will help you as a designer to highlight that specific section. So it really gives you more control over how to sort of create contrast on your pages while having a lot of structure. One of the rules that I really like to follow is that the less difference there is in grid sizes, the simpler and quieter the layout. Whereas the more the difference, the more it is dynamic and noisy. What this means is, like, you can create a grid which is an 8-point grid, right? Like I showed you initially, you have like a default pixel grid where everything is at a size of 8 points, and you have everything set up with has like multiples of 8. Similarly, you can have other layouts which have multiples of 10 or multiples of 12. The thing is, like, if you want to break a grid, if you want to make it noisy, then you can just have an 8-point grid, but you can start breaking that grid at multiple points, and it will immediately break that structure and will make it more dynamic. And that's the point of having grids. So I hope that has been really helpful in terms of thinking about how to set up grids and why these grids are really useful, and these are not really a limiting factor for you. The next thing that I want to talk about is this 8-point grid, which is a very common thing that is used in the industry, and a lot of people just use the 8-point grid. And you might ask about, why do we want to use 8-point grid, right? Like, there's a lot of different tutorials, different articles that you will find about 8-point grid, so I won't go into like how to set up an 8-point grid. It's often the default. It's very easy to set up. But the reason why we use an 8-point grid is because of scale, right? So if you think about creating a design, and if you want to, let's say, scale it to some new phone that is a little bit larger, it has better resolution, it has more pixels, then it is very easily scalable, which means that you can scale it to twice or thrice. If you like multiply it by 2, it gives you an even number of 16. It gives you, if you multiply by 3, it gives you an even number of 24. So it really fits with different device sizes and things like that. But it's not just about scaling up. What is great about 8, like you could think about like other even numbers like 6, right? You could even multiply 6 with 2 or 6 with 3, you still get even numbers. But the unique thing about the 8-point grid is that you can really scale down very well as well. So if you scale down by half, you see like it gives you 4, or if you scale down just by 3/4 or like 1/4, it gives you 6 points, right? So it still gives you even numbers when you're scaling down. And that's the unique thing about this number 8, where it's small enough where it could just be 1 pixel, but then it's very easy to both scale up and scale down. And that's the benefit of why we sort of use 8-point grid, and how it's sort of very easily scalable to any sort of device in today's world where it has different kinds of resolutions and things like that. So I hope you learned something useful in the video, and if you did, please like the video, and yeah, if you want to see more content like this, please subscribe. Thank you.